I had been in Italy as a soldier during World War II. I was an ordinary foot soldier with a rifle on my back and all that, full field pack. And I spent 2 years in Italy. 1 year while the combat was going on. And the second year, I was transferred to engineers from the infantry. I became a sign painter. We were working mostly with German prisoners of war who were rebuilding the highway. And I was in charge of, or involved in painting the signs for the road. You know, careful bump, sharp turn, no pavement, that sort of thing. I began making watercolors from little drawings I had done, thinking, well, I'll be going home eventually, and what's my future? You know, the only logical thing was to become an illustrator. At the end of my third year of service, and the war fighting was over, I was eligible for discharge and went back to college on the GI Bill. I should say that in high school, I had won a number of awards, poster contests for workers in factories, that sort of thing, for the war effort. But I had won prizes for a couple of paintings at National Scholastic High School, and one of them had been reproduced in Life magazine. The first day after when I went back to school, after discharge from the Army, this young man walked up to me and said, "How does it feel to be famous?" I said, "Well, it only lasted 5 minutes, but it was Andy Warhol." And he set up his easel right next to mine in painting class, and he sat right next to me in the drawing classes and so on. And we became very good friends. And one of his friends was the woman who became my wife, Dorothy Cantor. We traveled together as a group. We saw all the foreign movies, plays, went to concerts. You know, student tickets were cheap. And we went by trolley car. Nobody had an automobile. But we traveled as a group, about 5 of us, to all these cultural events. And I went to work privately with one of the professors of design who had a job doing catalogs or pamphlets for the Aluminum Company of America. And he hired me, I worked with him weekends and holidays for the next 3 years. So when Andy and I graduated, we came to New York together. We had a third friend who had left Carnegie, but who was older. George telephoned me and said, "Come to New York and bring Andy with you." And I have all the names of all these secretaries of the art directors of all these magazines and advertising houses that he'll turn over to us. And he helped us find a place to live and looked after us when we came to New York. And by the end of the first week, Andy had his first big assignment, Harper's Bazaar. I, on the other hand, wanted to be an art director. So my portfolio didn't quite fit in. It was full of ideas, And so I had a hard time finding a job. During the war years, I had concentrated on just making drawings, a kind of visual diary of my everyday experience in the Army to send home. No thought of anything in the future. And now I was concentrating on trying to become an abstract expressionist painter to fit in with the current, what was going on in the art world. Well, I did my best to be an abstract expressionist. But to me, I kept reading them as landscape. It's the landscape of southern Italy. You'd make a mess on the canvas, but it would turn into a slippery bunch of rocks on the mountainside in southern Italy that I was climbing over. I mean, based on real experience in the training for combat. We trained every day. I was in the infantry casualty replacement unit. You didn't expect to get home. But it became that, reliving that in this mush of paint that would suddenly turn into a mountain that I was climbing on. But back then, in the early 1950s, a lot of young men who'd been in the Army had studied on the GI Bill. So abstract expressionism was a perfect vehicle for kind of self-analysis, getting rid of stuff. And it flourished for the next few years. And we all had a common hero, who was Willem de Kooning, and his friends. They had a club called the Artist Club, called the Club. And every Friday night they had discussion groups that were very intellectually very exciting and seriously conducted. Everybody was fighting for their idea, for pushing their way of thinking. It was illuminating. We all learned a great deal from each other. But I developed a kind of reputation, became established as a serious artist, and accepted by people like de Kooning as a friend. And I was part of that gang, the 10th Street gang, it was called. When it came time to pick a topic for my MA thesis, I picked, I happened to be working for Mr. Sitnar on a catalog of toilet equipment, including showers and toilets and urinals for the American Standard Sanitary Company. And I did one page where the toilet seat flips in different positions, and I thought it was very funny. And then another page of urinals. And of course it's Duchamp. Even I at that point knew Duchamp. And I picked that as the subject for my thesis. Not specifically those images, but it led me directly to Duchamp and Picabia. I mean, it was a package. And I discovered that they had done all this Dada work, which they published in a publication in New York City called 291, which was the address of a gallery they exhibited in and published a magazine out of. but it was a Dada publication. But because the thesis was being done at the Institute of Fine Arts with Erwin Panofsky, whose main interest in art was subject matter, I had to find meaning, attribute meaning to what the toilet seat meant, what the urinal meant, the spark plug, whatever is they had illustrated their different kinds of articles or poetry with. It took me 5 years. But the interesting thing was that Picabia died while I got all the material together. I also had to learn to read French. And so I could translate everything. And I was approached by art magazines to write an article on Picabia. He'd been forgotten about in American art. At that moment, everything was about abstract expressionism. And so I did the article, and it got published in a brand new art magazine, the first big format, glossy paper art magazine, and given about 7 pages with illustrations, big illustrations of Picabia and Duchamp. It was called The Secret Language of Picabia and Duchamp. And everybody in the art world in New York read it because it was the first issue of this new magazine. And I became, from total anonymity, I became somebody who meant something of a kind of importance. And it changed my life in the art world. And it was soon followed by my first one-man show at a co-op gallery. And the art editors of the magazines sent their best reporters to my show. I got great reviews for my first show. Anyway, that was the beginning of my career as an exhibiting artist and as a published historian. It was a very funny moment. I left Mr. Sutnar. He wanted to make me a junior partner. And I knew that meant mostly going around getting business, jobs. And that was not my personality. I was the wrong person for that. So I left him and I jumped to Life magazine, Time Inc., and did a lot of cropping of photographs. Every story, the editors would decide what photographs would illustrate the story, and then how to crop the photographs. So you'd get a stack of photographs to illustrate the story, and then you'd mark them up in different percentages for the cropping and send them to an in-house photostat place and get back this stack of photographs and spent the rest of the day cropping the photograph in different manners. And I became very fascinated with what they decided wasn't interesting. What was the throwaway? And I guess it shows up in a lot of my paintings where the heads go off and the arms go off, as long as it makes a horizontal across the page. I was, like everybody else at the Institute, but spent a lot of time at the Metropolitan, which didn't have so many visitors. The place was mostly empty, except for the guards. And when you took breaks from reading in the library and doing all this heavy-duty studying, it was nice to get up and walk around for a half hour and go look at all these very obscure corners of the museum. And I found myself drawn to 3 or 4 objects that I never would have thought of looking at twice ordinarily. One was just the lower part of the head of Queen Ty, Tye, who was the mother, I believe, of Akhenaten, the pharaoh Akhenaten, who was a pivotal character in the history of Egyptian art. It's a fragment just of the chin and the mouth, the beginning of the nostrils, but it's the most beautiful thing. I just fell in love with it. And then I discovered, walking up and down Madison Avenue, that you could buy things like that. They were for sale. Then I had a year in Italy, a year in Rome. My wife and I haunted the flea markets. They have great flea markets in Rome. All kinds of things float up. And we had already started our passion for collecting, and the flea market offered this great thing. After every rainstorm around Rome, the flea market on Sunday would be flooded with little fragments of things that just would wash up in the fields. Little fragments, terracotta, fragments of statues, little heads. So we amassed this rather sizable collection and came back to New York, and eventually one of the art magazines decided to do an article on artists who collect. And our mantle, by then we were living in an old dilapidated brownstone, and we had a mantelpiece in our living room and another baby, 2 babies. We had 3 altogether in a row. And a photograph of our mantelpiece with some of these things we had collected in Rome showed up. And the head of the Metropolitan Museum came to see our collection. And everything we had was genuine. And he was even impressed with some of the things. What you're looking at now is more or less the 4th collection. But I mean, we've kept a few things from the original flea market collection, but I became interested in getting something from every culture that produced works of art. They all did, but works of art that I liked, that I responded to, or my wife responded to. When I studied art history at NYU Institute of Fine Arts, all of us, all the students who, at the end of 2 years, would memorize this publication called Propylaean Kunstgeschichte, means gateway to art, and it just reproduced without text, except for the titles, where it was all what was considered, several hundred key works of art and architecture that should be known to anybody who's getting a degree in art history. I took my turn memorizing the book, and I picked out about 15 places that I decided I would want to visit someday. And eventually I did. I decided to do watercolors of these places, which included Machu Picchu, Guatemala. I did 3 places in Egypt, as large scale watercolors. Turkey, Syria, several places in Rome, England, Stonehenge, and a couple cathedrals that have been abandoned and the roofs fallen in. I did one watercolor in Palmyra of the gate that was demolished by ISIS. And then a couple places here in the United States. White House ruins by Anasazi at the Canyon de Chelly, spelled Chellly. And I did watercolors at the Grand Canyon, and then of course New York City. I did one. But it had added up to about 15. And then I translated it into mostly aquatint etchings, which were issued as a portfolio. I never returned to Time Inc., to Life magazine. I got a job teaching on the basis of that experience in graphic design. That's what I began teaching at Pratt Institute, graphic design. And then I ended up doing one day a week at Yale, also teaching design, figurative drawing. And then I got the full-time tenured position at Brooklyn College. At Pratt, I should say that one of the teachers was a woman named Mercedes Matter. She invited everybody on the faculty who was interested. Whoever wanted to work from the figure should show up at her place on McDougal Alley Sunday nights. And she had a wonderful collection of saris that she collected in India, a couple, and some other kinds of fabrics from various trips. And she would just scatter them around, and the kids who were modeling would just fall asleep on them. And to me, they looked like rocks. And I made the connection between the rocks and the figure. And people had been looking at my paintings of Roman ruins and Positano cliffs and kept finding figures in them anyway. And so I decided to paint the figures as rocks, putting all these courses together, design and figure drawing and the history of art. And I got caught up in setting up problems and combining them, these things, how to put the figure in a composition in terms of layout, the design of a page as the major element, and then how to render it in terms of light, as in Rembrandt, or flat silhouette, as in Egyptian art, or to approach it as a kind of Zen experience, according to Chinese painting. I began setting up specific problems, but essentially I began teaching one course, combining all of these courses. And I developed that as a kind of program. And that's what I ended up teaching for the next 20 or some years. I switched from painting abstract expressionism to incorporating many of these ideas within a very relatively short time. And because I made that switch, sometime in the, it must have been like 1959 or 1960, after having established a nice reputation as a second generation abstract expressionist, to suddenly emerging as a figure painter, I started using some of the figures I had drawn in the drawing group, Mercedes Matter. And the first paintings are done from those drawings, making up the surface textures. I went along from memory and imagination. And then I started hiring the models to come and recreate them in my own studio, recreate their poses as rocks. Though I didn't tell them they were posing as rocks. But they meant nothing more than that, just as elements of a design. The fact that they were nude was simply because the body is so interesting as a series of interlocking forms. It has nothing to do with the sex which everybody expected. It took me by surprise. People tried to interpret them in terms of sexual terms, and were stymied. And I got all kinds of insults. A lot of paintings were locked out, put in separate rooms at exhibitions. My first one-man show traveled to Wichita, Kansas. And in Wichita, they put a police cordon around the whole museum. And you had to show your age before you could enter the building. And even so, they had about 4 of the paintings put in a separate room that was kept locked. You had to have special reason for seeing them. But that was a total misinterpretation of what I thought I was doing. I decided to ignore all that. Let the chips fall where they would on interpretation. And when I was invited to speak various places and showing slides of my work, I would emphasize the historical background, where the ideas came from, and emphasize the composition and not the meaning. That seemed to create its own problems, which I've ignored over the years. This community called Highland Lakes, it's on a mountaintop. It's the highest residential neighborhood. It's a blue-collar community. There were a bunch of these cabins for sale. And so the fellows in this building, who were conservators, had a bunch of friends in the art world. A very mixed bag of people. And they got them all to buy cabins within a short time. We moved in as a part of a community. Anyway, I began doing portraits of all these people. And a lot of the portraits that you see on the website are of people, our neighbors around the lake. And I would just give them as gifts. But I got to know, it was a way of getting to know the people well. I've had a few commissions of painting retiring college presidents, which came out of my association with Brooklyn College. I painted the retiring president of Brown University. His name was Raymond Hefner. His cousin is the one who published Playboy magazine. And he sat for his portrait while watching the first of the moon landings was playing in this, on a little TV set in this 18th century room while I did my painting. While I was there, I was on hold for flying down to Washington, D.C. to do a portrait of the man who was vice president under Nixon while Nixon was in China. In case Nixon was to be assassinated, this other guy, Agnew, would become Mr. President. And this was for Time Magazine. Nixon, but that got canceled because Agnew got arrested in the White House. But that led to my doing a portrait of Kissinger for Time Magazine. And I said I'd only work directly from life. But when I showed up to do the painting with all my material, he objected, and it was only under some kind of duress that he agreed to pose to give me 4 hours. It took two days to get through the 4 hours of actual work. Another interesting adventure was at the University of Chicago, and the painting, when it was finished, was hung at a student lounge and kidnapped by a women's group, a student women's group. And they said I had insulted all womankind with my portrait of her. She tended to look like George Washington. But then it got returned. And then it was kidnapped again by a radical group, political radical, who didn't like Hannah Gray or what she stood for. And they kidnapped the painting and photographed it once a week in a kind of insulting place against the sewer, against the hydrant, against a garbage can, that sort of thing. And week after week this went on. It made the local newspapers and published a photograph every week, but got me no publicity in New York. And it went on for about 3 months. And finally got returned with some passage from some novel. I couldn't understand it. That was I don't know how it related to what this group stood for that had kidnapped it. But it was written in float pen over the back of the painting, the whole back. And eventually it will bleed through the front. There's no way of eliminating it. I don't know where it's hanging now. But Hannah Gray was quoted in the paper when it was returned as saying she's sorry it was found. She thought it was not a very nice painting. So I had not too much luck as a portrait painter, except for my friends who weren't in a position to criticize the work. My interest remains in doing the painting, and that's what keeps me going. It's a big puzzle beyond solving. I keep looking for the solution. I've not yet arrived at an ultimate painting. And I guess I never will.